everyone to this launch event of the reports of the ICRS Working Group on COVID and Democracy. My name is Timothy Sist. I'm the director of ICRS, the Institute for Regional and Comparative Studies here at the University of Denver in our Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. So a very warm welcome to everyone. As the pandemic evolves, so too do events, and we are pleased to have here a hybrid event with a small audience here at the University of Denver, as well as streaming online. So again, welcome very much. I'm very pleased to be here together with my colleagues, Abigail Kabandula and Oliver Kaplan here in person. And I'll also introduce our other panelists here in just a moment. But we're pleased here to be launching 4 major research and scholarly reports on the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on governance and democracy globally. And we have 4 reports that are being launched today. One report is a global report. The other 3, relate first of all to Africa and to Latin America, into the Middle East and North Africa. My colleague Yunus Abiyub will be on in just a moment. I'll be introducing all of our panelists, as well as our keynote speaker for this event. Let me just go back and first put this into just a moment of context. We're gathered here this morning at a time when the world is seeing overlapping and indeed reinforcing global crises. We see this, of course, at the geostrategic level in terms of the Ukraine crisis, which has escalated in the last few days, but a very much a long-running, long-standing build-up to that crisis. We have the planetary crisis of climate change and its effects. And then, of course, the public health crisis, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. And in fact, a little bit later on today, we're likely to see from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention here in the United States new guidelines with regard to the easing of some mask requirements and other requirements with regard to COVID. But I think it's important to highlight that these crises present a new challenge to all of us in the international community, and that they are indeed interrelated. The Institute for Comparative and Regional Studies was founded actually early 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic, and it brought together the various regional and area studies programs of the Corbell School, and brought them under a broad umbrella of Institute in Comparative Regional Studies. And I'm very pleased to be directing that. We have both, as we have a very specific regional centered programming related to broader issues in international studies, as well as cross-cutting programming such as this. Why focus on COVID and democracy? It was a little backstory to the COVID and Democracy Working Group. That early in 2020, when the ICRS was founded, we had initially proposed to the sponsors, who were very grateful of this activity, the DT Institute in Washington, D.C., that sometime around June of 2020, we would hold a major conference on the effects of COVID. And here we are nearly, some 2 years later, and we have then, rather than holding a conference at that time, which of course, as we all know, was not possible, we developed the expert working group. The expert working group is comprised of 25 academics from around the world, indeed, each representing very unique insights into these regions and into specific countries within them. The expert working group methodology that we followed falls very much along the lines of best practices in this area to assemble the very best minds and the top thinkers to come at this from a regional and comparative point of view. And so each of the working group members were asked to contribute to the reports, and as you'll see the reports, each of the reports is authored by a wide range of working group members. It'd be important to say that none of the reports are designed to reflect a consensus among the working group members, or that is a consensus to the very letter of the reports. But at the same time, they're designed to reflect the broad thinking, the wisdom of really top experts in this field. When I come back on in a few minutes, I'll highlight some of the findings of the global report, and indeed we'll be going to first myself to introduce the findings of the global report, to my colleague Abigail Kabandula for the Africa report, and Oliver, and also Eunice, and I'll introduce them in time. But first, we're very pleased to have an important keynote speaker, and this is Lisa Peterson, who is the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for the United States in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. We're very pleased to have the Acting Assistant Secretary to provide some reflective remarks on the reports, which we've provided in advance. She is a specialist on a wide range of issues very specific to some of the content of these reports on issues of citizen security, for example. And she was a prior ambassador to Eswatini, which some of you may know as the erstwhile Swaziland in Africa, and has a very wide range of experience as a senior career foreign service officer. Beyond that ambassadorial posting, she was the DCM in Yaoundé, Cameroon, and has served throughout Africa in Nigeria, Zambia, where Abigail hails from originally, and Kenya, the DRC, South Africa, and the Democratic and the Central African Republic. She specializes in democratic transitions, in peace negotiations. And thank you, Madam Acting Assistant Secretary, for coming on today. And we're very keen on your reflections on this wide range of work in which we've been involved. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Sisk, distinguished panelists and guests, it is a real pleasure to join you virtually today. And I want to thank the University of Denver's Korbel Institute for organizing this discussion, and to the expert working group for its substantive analysis on the issue that we continue to grapple with every day, the state of democracy in the face of COVID-19. I want to commend the group's important work, and we look to its findings as a reminder of academia's critical role in strengthening our understanding of the global landscape today. For example, the report of the Global Trends subgroup cites the growing concern of a global recession in democracy and good governance. We agree. Subject matter experts note that there's been a steady decline in the quality of democracy over the last 16 years in both emerging and established democracies. Over this same period, there's been an equally steady increase in public dissatisfaction with how democracies are functioning. We note your assessment that, and I quote, democracy, already under threat, is on pandemic-induced life support. In just the past week, we've seen a brazen attack by Russia on Ukraine, due in no small measure to the latter's democratic aspirations. Russia's attack is one of the most significant tests of our international rules-based order since World War II. Russia's further invasion of Ukraine is not just a matter of violating Ukraine's sovereignty, but it's an attack on Ukraine's democracy and on the significant reform progress the country has made over the last several years. A truly democratic Ukraine is the antithesis to an authoritarian Russia, and it's our job as the international community to support the Ukrainian people and Ukraine's democracy in the face of Russian aggression. Today, regimes around the world continue to use the COVID-19 pandemic as an excuse to suppress dissent, silence the media, and tighten their grip on power. Democratic backsliding and rising authoritarianism in countries around the world have disproportionately affected marginalized populations, including LGBTQI+ persons, persons with disabilities, and members of ethnic, racial, and religious minority groups. Democracy, in many ways, remains at risk. Democracies are contending with a perfect storm of threats, both from within and from external factors, including a rising tide of transnational repression, corruption, and authoritarianism. For example, many countries have passed laws restricting civil society funding and operations. Some governments have misused national security laws to clamp down on the ability of civil society actors to exercise their rights to freedom of expression, association, movement, and peaceful assembly. Human rights and fundamental freedoms are in peril. But the good news is that just as autocracies are leveraging the vulnerabilities in democratic governance that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated, democracies globally continue to address issues and make strides to demonstrate that democracy delivers. The working group's report delves into the question of democratic resilience and ways in which the pandemic provides evidence of new demands for increased democracy, respect for human rights, and inclusive governance. During the first Summit for Democracy, which President Biden hosted last December, Secretary Blinken led a dialogue around this exact question. The Bolstering Democratic Resilience panel, which is available on the Summit YouTube channel, highlighted efforts to reverse pandemic-spurred closures of civic and political space and to dismantle emergency powers that restrict human rights and fundamental freedoms. In that panel, and together with our like-minded allies and civil society partners, the United States emphasized our commitment and reaffirmed our focus on building stronger, more effective democratic governments that deliver the prosperity and freedom that all people deserve. Notably, our civil society partners rightly identified a need for governments to focus efforts on pandemic prevention and preparedness, grounded in respect and promotion of democratic values. Today, democracy remains an aspiration of people throughout the world, demonstrated through peaceful protests, citizen campaigns, and actions of leaders alike. The pursuit of democracy is as alive as ever. And the pandemic has brought out many of democracy's greatest strengths. Democracies have developed and shared medical breakthroughs, data, and effective solutions, and this is paying off. Transparency, accountability, inclusivity, and the free exchange of ideas and solutions lead to public trust in democratic governance. Whether responding to COVID-19 or other challenges, states in which there is mutual trust between citizens and governments harness the best ideas, implement them, and make our nations stronger. As this expert panel will likely agree, there's no better form of government for promoting and protecting freedom, equality, and the dignity of every person, and for fostering peace, security, and prosperity globally. However, sustaining democracy requires hard work, careful stewardship, and constant vigilance. We know that we must continue to demonstrate that democracy delivers for all people, and we must ensure our efforts are inclusive and participatory from the start. It means establishing inclusive institutions and processes, enabling people to be involved in decisions that affect their lives, and ensuring public administration is transparent and accountable. This fosters societies that are resistant to authoritarian influence, corruption, conflict, and both natural and human-made crises. Together, we must make the case to people all over the world that democratic governance and respect for human rights deliver. We must demonstrate that this is the most effective way to reduce fragility, advance sustainable development, and mitigate risks of violent conflict and instability. Our response, both within individual countries and collectively, must be informed by the contributions of those on the front lines and account for the needs of marginalized and vulnerable populations. And when the COVID-19 crisis is behind us, we must intensify efforts to root out these inequalities and systemic injustices. Recognizing this global landscape, the United States has taken steps to galvanize the world behind democratic renewal. As part of the Summit for Democracy, countries, including the United States, made commitments that they will fulfill. For example, as announced by President Biden during the first summit event in December, our new Presidential Initiative for Democratic Renewal, which includes the US commitments to support independent media, strengthen electoral integrity, bolster democratic reformers, and advance technology for democracy and fight corruption. For example, we're enhancing the work of the Global Anti-Corruption Consortium, a multilateral initiative that promotes a transnational approach to combating corruption. This program assists investigative journalists and NGOs in collaboratively uncovering corruption, demanding reform, and increasing availability of legally actionable information for use by government and law enforcement. Through USAID, we are working with partners to build a coalition for electoral integrity, which will establish guiding principles and codes of conduct for free and fair elections. And we're launching the Advanced and Girls Civic and Political Leadership Initiative to facilitate the full and safe exercise of women's rights and responsibilities. These are only a few examples. The full presidential initiative is extensive and we hope will foster widespread change. If I can just wrap up, I'll note Amartya Sen famously observed that no functioning democracy has ever experienced a famine. Studies show that transitions to democracy have a positive impact on health outcomes, such as an increase in life expectancy and reduction in child mortality, and that citizens under democratic governance face significantly lower death rates from non-communicable diseases. We need to work collectively to ensure that the public understands these truths. As President Biden has noted, it's the challenge of our time to demonstrate that democracies can deliver by improving the lives of their people in tangible ways and tackling the greatest problems facing the world. This challenge is best met if we start by upholding our commitments to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, especially during times Our response, both within individual countries and collectively, must be informed by the contributions of those on the front lines and account for the needs of marginalized and vulnerable populations. And going forward, we must intensify efforts to root out inequalities and systemic injustices. I thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share this time with you, and I very much look forward to your presentations. Thank you very much.
I think you've already picked up on three very important points that come across in all these reports from our working group, from the experts. And the first one, of course, is on the effect of the pandemic on issues of social polarization and trust. And I think the extent to which we have a central finding or a central theme is that across the board, from a regional and comparative studies perspective, that the pandemic has widened issues of polarization, has led to distrust, and distrust both in the state, and from a sort of a vertical social cohesion perspective, and distrust within societies at the sort of person-to-person or quotidian level. These are very important observations, and then likewise your point as well with regard to the importance of inclusivity. I mean, this was a really key finding. If we think about it, if the pandemic has led to these sort of multiple overlapping exclusions and discriminations, as is documented in each of these reports, then the antidote is inclusive democracy and more centrist-oriented democracy. So thank you so much for those comments. I'm going to switch hats a little bit from being the event moderator to reporting on some of the findings from the global report. And I'll take a few minutes to do that, and then we'll turn to my colleagues, and we'll just go region by region here on the various reports, starting first with Africa, then moving to MENA, and then to Latin America. But in presenting this global report, first I'd just like to thank the members of the subgroup on the global subgroup, included Carolyn Hartzell of Gettysburg College, Anna Jarstad of Uppsala University in Sweden, Neshla Shirgi at the University of San Diego, and Massimo Tomasoli, who's Director of Global Programs and Permanent Observer of International IDEA to the United Nations. So we're a very tight-knit global subgroup that took a look at the 4 dimensions that we each sought to look at across our various reports. These dimensions being the sort of combination of direct and indirect effects of the pandemic on democracy, and particularly then looking at some of the ways in which democracies have responded. And I think this picks up on another of Ambassador Peterson's point about the nature of regime types. And early on in the pandemic, the belief that autocracies, because they had better social control, somehow would be better able to respond to the pandemic, essentially through their ability to coerce. But this actually hasn't been the case as we look through the evidence, and I think we'll have a mention or a case study in the Latin America report, for example, on Costa Rica, as an example, a context in which democratic regime types have responded equally well, if not better, to the pandemic. So I think one of the myths that's been out there during the pandemic period is somehow that a control model may work to control the virus better than one that's based on a more democratic model in which there's a high degree of trust in governance. And so there in our global report, we also have a case study on Sweden, for example. It's a very interesting case study indeed, which I'd point your attention to. Well, let me get kind of organized here with regard to my presentation on the Global Trends Report. Really have 4 principal conclusions to share with you today. And the first, I think, really starts with the broader global context. And again, Ambassador Peterson mentioned this, that really beginning around 2007, 2008, most of the major organizations that monitor democracy and governance around the world began to see measurable declines in the level and quality of democracy globally. And the report highlights this as the sort of acceleration, magnification, amplification of democratic erosion globally. This is widely evidenced in the report with regard to several of the major scholarly or academic tracking of democracy and governance around the world, including, for example, the Varieties of Democracy Project, their latest report titled Autocratization Turns Viral. And that very much captures the overall understanding. The most recent of these reports that came out that really sort of a global review is the 2021 a Global State of Democracy report from International IDEA. Well, this was backstopped, of course, by a private sector report came out earlier this month from the Economist Intelligence Unit. So we note that IDEA in their measures shows that over half of the world's population has seen or lived in a context of democratic erosion in the last few years. And indeed, what we see is a kind of broader concern on the nature of regime type globally, the increasing spread of autocracy, and the ways in which autocratic regimes have used the pandemic to essentially engage in what might be called opportunistic repression. So this is, again, well documented, and the experts have spent quite a bit of time looking at, what are the very specific COVID-related effects. And I think in terms of caveats on our work and report, this may be one to highlight, which is the difficulty of drawing a direct, clear causal mechanism between the public health crisis and these broader trends that were already underway. The second point that I'd like to make is that the direct effects of COVID have been palpable and widely seen. More than 42 countries over the course of the period in which the expert working group is focused on 2020 and 2021 saw postponement of elections. And in that postponement of elections, as we've seen in some cases, the consequences can be rather dire. When elections are postponed, there's a high degree of uncertainty. And one may point to the context of Ethiopia, for example, as a case in which the postponement of election combined with a whole range of other factors in terms of the escalatory pattern leading to the civil war outbreak in Ethiopia. Across the board, we saw negative, deleterious effects on electoral processes. We saw negative and deleterious effects on civil and political rights. As I suggested earlier, opportunistic repression by governments around the world. So as much as I'd like to assemble a group of scholars and global specialists and try to, kind of paint a more rosy picture of the effect of the pandemic on civil and political rights, unfortunately, it's very hard to find examples or cases of positive trends. They are out there, and I'll return to that in just a moment. We don't want the entire report to be completely negative, as there may be, as we know, in crises, moments of opportunity for democratic renewal, as Ambassador Peterson also suggested. Well, number three, the most important point, I think, in terms of what I'd like to share with regard to the indirect effects of COVID on democracy and governance is even a more challenging, and I would argue more alarming set of conditions. It's really quite well documented at this point that COVID has disproportionately affected the marginalized segments of society, of women and girls, of minorities, and of LGBTQ individuals, as Ambassador Peterson also highlighted. And these are very well described and documented in the reports in terms of equity globally and social rights. We see a widening patterns of inequality, and not just inequality of what we might call vertical inequality, but inequality that overlaps with identity and with group identity, so-called horizontal inequalities. And of course, this is very alarming because, as we know, scholars like myself who study the drivers of civil war and the drivers of fragility globally, we see that inequality, and particularly group-based inequality, is closely associated with conflict and with the escalation of violence. So this is one area that we'd really like to highlight as being a particularly negative effect of the pandemic. It's affected almost all of the drivers of conflict that we would have in our toolbox of what the drivers of conflict may be. USAID probably has one of the best conflict assessment frameworks out there that highlights the importance of basic human needs as and the role of greed, of natural resource management, access to natural resources, and of ideology and grievance as drivers of conflict. When people's human needs are not met, when there is injustice in the distribution of natural resources, when there is starkly ideological polarization in societies, we see these as recipes for tensions and sets the stage or creates the vulnerabilities for violence. Unfortunately, the pandemic has seen a reversal in gains made toward the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's through those Sustainable Development Goals that these underlying issues of fragility can be addressed. We've seen differential effects of the pandemic on minorities worldwide. And one of the most, I think, compelling findings that you'll see in the report is documentation of the ways in which minorities in contexts like Turkey and India and other places have been the target of discrimination and stigmatization in the context of the pandemic. And then we have certain classes of those in the labor market and the economy that have also been affected by the pandemic. And this would include small businesses, but also those who work in informal labor markets. This is one of the things that for me really came across in the report on MENA was the proportion of individuals who work in an informal labor market and have seen a very kind of direct threats to their livelihoods from lockdowns and other mechanisms to control the virus. The fourth point is around these drivers of conflict, and we see that the COVID pandemic has also affected non-state armed actors in the international community, and particularly armed groups that have been able to mobilize around the pandemic period. Also seeing the kind of increase in global levels of youth unemployment, which has us concerned about mechanisms for recruitment of those who have lost their livelihoods into violent extremism, and also a deleterious effect on peace agreements worldwide. And I would point your attention to the contribution in the global report by Anna Yarstad, one of the top scholars on global peace agreements, who reports a lack of progress in conditions of armed conflict around the world and relates that to concerns of the COVID pandemic. So the global report is a very troubling one, to be honest, and the global context is a very troubling one. Where do we turn for that silver lining that I intimated I would come back to? The first is the importance of civic space and of protecting civic space and protecting civil society organizations. The areas that need to be redoubled in terms of global democracy building really have to do with reinvigorating civil society. In many cases, in many contexts, we've seen local and global civil society organizations being the last line of defense in terms of accountability and transparency. The second point is echoing some of the comments coming from the United Nations, and particularly the United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, who talks about the need in our common agenda, the most recent big global report of the United Nations, his new agenda, of the importance of renewing the social contract. And this does speak very directly to the importance of inclusivity and inclusive governance. What kind of social contract, I think, is the most important thing to ask. Members of the working group were really adamant about this need to go back to, in many cases, to prior political settlements that are frayed, and the importance of really, and to me this is quite important, maybe as a concluding comment, the need to go back to thinking about democratic transitions. If we're actually in a global context of worsening autocracy, yet we see these resistance, we see publics that are unwilling to accept new forms of autocracy, then the answer may be to revive in some ways democratic transitions and to begin thinking about democratic transitions. Very last point that I'd like to make is one with regard to the vulnerabilities that COVID has exposed. These are vulnerabilities for individuals around the world, again, loss of livelihood, stigmatization, discrimination, et cetera, that really the part of any new social contract has to be a kind of a recommitment to taking care of the poorest of the poor, the most marginalized elements of society, as these are the ones that have suffered most under the COVID-19 pandemic. So I hope you all enjoy the global report. This will be available to you here at this launch. You'll be getting a link and a thank you note for attending today. There'll be a link to these reports, and we really look forward to your to your hoping that they will make a contribution to your understanding, but also maybe a hope that they'll make a contribution to your own renewed commitment to not accept autocratization and not accept the kind of negative effects of the COVID pandemic that we've seen. Okay, I'll switch back over and put on my hat as moderator. I'm not actually wearing a hat, but nonetheless, figuratively, I'll turn it back over in my moderator role. And I'll turn it over to Abigail Kabandula, my colleague here. Abigail is the director of the Africa Center here at the Corbell School and under ICRS. She comes to us with a PhD from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where she worked in the Human Security Program there. She's been a research scientist at the Pardee Center for International Futures Research here at the Corbell School, and comes to us as well with a degree from the University of Cape Town and the University of Zambia. Abigail is a specialist in international peace and security and is just about to launch a new project on special political missions in Africa. Abigail, thank you for your oversight and work on the Africa group, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Steve. So I'm going to try and balance having my notes and the microphone, which is, I haven't done this before, so let's see how it goes. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. And it's a pleasure seeing many of you on a Friday afternoon, and also people online. I'm going to talk about the Africa Center or Africa Subgroup report of the Trends report. And I want to say thank you, first of all, to the group members who were Timothy Adivela, who was then at Boston College, now he has relocated to Ghana, and Bonifasi Dulani at the University of Malawi, and our very own Kali Mitchell here at the University of Denver, Catherine Klaus at the University of San Francisco, Jeremy Seekins from the University of Cape Town, Timothy Shaw from the University of Massachusetts. As a way of introduction, I wanted to say that the story of COVID, democracy and governance in Africa is a tale of resilience and adaptability at many levels, even though democracy is declining in many parts of the continent. So at the start of the pandemic, many global leaders expressed concern that the impact of COVID-19 in Africa, and given the weakness in the health systems and the fragile economies and lack of resources and vulnerable populations, many were concerned that the international community, many in the international community were concerned that COVID-19 would wreak havoc across the continent. And so I have categorized this part of Africa as, you know, the apocalypse that never really came to be. We also had warning tales, particularly from philanthropists Bill and Melinda Gates, who have invested heavily in the health sector in Africa. And Melinda Gates, in an interview with CNN on April 12, 2021, that the coronavirus pandemic will impact the developing world the most, and that she foresaw Africa will have dead bodies lying on the streets. Bill Gates, in his end note, acknowledged that he had feared that COVID-19 would rampant in low-income countries. How did this turn out? Well, with resilience and adaptability, Africa continues to fight the good fight as prevalence and mortality rates remain much lower than the US or Europe. Since the first COVID-19 case was reported in Egypt in 2020, Africa constitutes only 3.4% of global cases and 4% of world deaths. The continent has relatively low mortality rates compared to the global south. If you compare them to Latin America, Asia, Middle East, we can say 30% for the Latin America and 23% for Asia and the Middle East. The largest number of COVID cases in Africa occur in countries with the most cases, notably South Africa, Tunisia, Egypt, and Morocco, which is not surprising because these countries have high interaction with countries across the world. How do Africans perceive their governments in handling citizens and in handling the pandemic? Well, we saw lockdowns and curfews and police cracking down on people who were breaking curfews on the continent. However, when we look at Afrobarometer survey, we show that 2 in 3 African citizens accepted such measures as necessary. Indeed, African governments generally received positive marks from the sample that was taken. 59% of citizens felt that they were doing a great job. The positive remarks were also applied to both democratic countries such as Mauritius, where 85% of the citizens thought their government were doing a great job in handling the pandemic. Even in authoritarian countries like Eswatini, Africa's sole absolute monarchy, had 90% of citizens rate the government very positively. Nonetheless, the continent faces vaccination challenges. African countries have either singularly or part of the global COVAX scheme procured vaccines and embarked on vaccination campaigns. However, compared to other global regions, Africa lags in vaccinations, with only 4.4% of the adult population vaccinated by the end of September 2021. Overall proportion of the COVID-19 vaccine administered in Africa represent only 1.6% of the total number of global vaccines. 2 major factors contribute to these low vaccination rates. That is vaccine supply and vaccine hesitancy. So if I may speak to vaccine supply, African countries have faced supply challenges, well, because most developed countries decided to stockpile, so African countries could not access those vaccines, but also they did not have enough resources to be able to procure their own. And so they have depended mostly on vaccine donations from China, Russia, and other Western countries through the COVAX vaccine scheme and the African Union. However, the COVAX vaccine scheme has faced many challenges in coordination and distributions, particularly in earlier days. Large numbers of vaccine supplied to African countries had very short shelf life. So by the time they were actually going to be administered in those African countries, most of these vaccines were expired. So by July 2020, close to 500,000 vaccine doses were destroyed in Malawi, South Africa, Liberia, Mauritania, the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, the Comoros, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo due to supply delays. A big challenge has been vaccine hesitancy. Hundreds of African citizens are hesitant to receive vaccinations even when vaccines are available because of the lack of confidence in the vaccines. But this is not common to Africa. We have seen it here in the US, in Europe, and in Latin America. In other parts of the world, however, COVID-19 vaccine hesitance is driven by mistrust of medical professionals and concerns about potential side effects. We found that in Africa, citizens with reluctance towards vaccination against COVID can be attributed to misinformation and conspiracy theories spread mostly on social media. One particular video that was circulating was Bill Gates, who was caught out of context, saying that if we need to reduce world population, the population that we should get rid of was obviously in Africa. So, but he was caught out of context. So that video circulated across the country, particularly among young people. In the report, we drew on the Afrobarometer survey data from 15 countries using national representative samples and face-to-face interviews to understand the drivers of COVID-19 vaccination hesitancy. The analysis focuses on both the social and political drivers of COVID-19 hesitancy to assess whether governance might be driving the reluctance among African peoples to take up COVID-19 vaccine. The survey results show that high levels of COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy, attributing 47% of adult population said they would not get a vaccine if the vaccine had been made available. Vaccine hesitancy was highest in Senegal, which came up with 4 in 5 adult citizens would not get vaccinated, followed by the Gambia with 77%. While Moroccans and Mauritians were the least likely to be hesitant to get vaccinated, they said the sample says 1 in 5 of the adult citizens in both countries would be willing to get vaccinated. By far, the most important drivers of COVID-19 vaccination uptake and hesitance in Africa are political in nature. The ability of African government to convince their citizens about the safety of the COVID-19 vaccine is the most important factor in convincing Africans whether to get vaccinated or not. At the same time, we notice that citizens who express satisfaction with democracy in their countries and consider corruption to be declining have had greater faith in government and in turn express greater willingness to be vaccinated. Further confidence in government statistics on COVID-19 also was a significant effect in lowering vaccination hesitancy. Looking at COVID-19 and on civil, the impact of COVID-19 on civil and political rights, we found that, like many other countries worldwide, African governments have struggled to balance the harsh social controls necessary for managing a highly contagious virus with limiting government power and the protection of civil liberties. The pandemic has also provided a pretext for authoritarian regimes to further constrict civil and political liberties of their citizens. The survey conducted by the Mo Ibrahim Foundation in 37 countries show that most Africans feel COVID-19 measures have threatened human and civil liberties, human rights and civil liberties. Perhaps some of the images that we saw with regard to civil liberties that were disturbing came from Kenya and Uganda. In both Kenya and Uganda, lockdown measures have been marked by state force and violence, involving an already violent, reckless, and corrupt police force. During Kenya's first 9 weeks in the pandemic, and corrupt police killed about 15 people while enforcing COVID-19 lockdown rules, including a 13-year-old boy who was standing in a balcony in Nairobi. And then we also had a 19-year-old boy who was killed by being beaten by the police. So there were also reports that show that some people died more from police brutality than from the pandemic in the initial phases. On the effects of COVID on democratic institutions, we find that the resilience of democracy across most of Africa is quite concerning. Several military coups that you might be aware of. In 2021 alone, we had a military coup in Niger, Chad, the second one in Mali, and Guinea, and then Sudan. These times are reminiscent of the pre-democratization periods in the 1990s. While the quality of democracy on the continent has been questionable, many of us know that, but for the last decades, we saw that change of government did not happen through coups, but through an electoral process. The coronavirus is also placing additional strains on democratic institutions throughout the continent. There have been concerned about incumbent politicians undermining democratic opposition and delaying elections to consolidate power. Due to COVID-19, we had 15 African countries postponed election at the local, municipal, and national levels. Additionally, there have been concerning reports of corruption and abuse of power in several African countries. Nonetheless, democracy looks much healthier, even though imperfect, in sub-Saharan Africa than in the Sahel region. For example, elections held under the pandemic in Malawi and the Seychelles in 2020 and in Zambia in 2021 resulted in the eviction of the incumbent president and ruling party from the government. In South Africa, the ruling party for the first time had less than half of the national vote for the first time since the ANC came into power. These electoral turnovers happened despite pre-election concern that there will be malpractices or unfairness on the side of the incumbent governments. In In terms of the state fragility and violence, we find that a number of insurgents, terrorist groups have capitalized on the socioeconomic effects of COVID-19 and strict government measures to mitigate the spread of the virus to foster their insurgents and propaganda. In Somalia and the Sahel particularly, and in Mozambique, we saw intensified attacks on civilians, and the propaganda now incorporates COVID-19. One of the propaganda is that Islamic groups are saying that COVID-19 is a punishment, particularly for the French, for intervening and joining counterinsurgents in the Sahel, and that the restrictions on the civilians are targeted towards Muslims. We also noted that the attacks on civilians have gone up. For example, AFRICOMAND Commander Staff Stephen Thompson advised that Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Al-Shabaab see the COVID-19 crisis as an opportunity to further their terrorist agenda. So in March of 2020 alone, suspected jihadists killed 25 soldiers at a Malayan army base. And then they also kidnapped a high-profile Malayan opposition leader. We saw Boko Haram launch one of its deadliest attacks on Chadian forces that killed at least 92 soldiers. We also saw militants in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique gain more ground. To conclude, I wanted to come back to my remarks in the introduction to say that the tale of COVID-19 in Africa is that of resilience and adaptability, but also concerning in terms of declining levels of democracy. We have seen that despite the significant challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, Africa has shown high levels of resilience at many levels. Locally led and informal actors such as women, youth, and religious organizations have effectively collaborated with formal measures and federal relief packages to support citizens during the pandemic and to reduce economic impacts. These local efforts are also bolstered by regional and national level responses, including the African Union COVID-19 Response Fund and tax relief and social grants services by central governments. Experts have also attributed the continent's resilience to global African diaspora who have regularly sent money to their families and relatives so that they can buy medicine, food, and be able to go to the hospital. Additionally, the experience of the past pandemics and health crisis have aided the resilience of several African countries, particularly when we look at East Africa, when we had recently the Omicron. East Africa was almost not impacted at all. And so that is a testament to their previous efforts in dealing with pandemics. At the same level, we know democracy resilience is concerning, and in some parts of Africa, especially when we look at the Sahel and West Africa. So read the report, you get more details about some of these issues that I've highlighted. Thank you, Tim.
Well, thank you, Abigail. You'll find very detailed look, for example, at the case of South Africa, which of course has been one of those instances in which there's now vaccine production in South Africa to respond to broader issues in Africa. Let's turn now to, we have with us joining us virtually for our Middle East and North Africa report, our normal director of the Middle East Center, Nader Hashemi, is on sabbatical this term, and our colleague Andrea Stanton has been the interim director for this report. We're turned in terms of authorship and of management of our Middle East and North African subgroup to Dr. Yunus Abiyub. Yunus, thank you for joining us today. Yunus is with the head of governance and state building for the Middle East and North Africa region at the United Nations. He's within the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. I believe that's right, Yunus, is that right? DPPA. He comes to us with over 25 years experience in conflict prevention, having worked in contexts such as Burundi and the special political mission there in Burundi. And Eunice, let me just first of all thank you for your work on this report. It's a fantastic report, and we really look forward to your summary here this afternoon.
You want to know that we can't hear?
Can't hear. We're just a little audio. Eunice, we're unable to hear, unfortunately, but I can see from here that it looks like the mute is on or off. So.
Can you hear me?
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Eunice.
Okay.
We're very good to go. Thank you so much.
Okay, good. Well, I was saying thank you, Tim, for the introduction, and thank you to all the colleagues from the Joseph Corbell Center and Denver University. As you said, yes, I've worked mostly with the Department of Political Affairs in conflict-affected countries around the world, but I also moved during my career between DPA and also social economic issues and issues of development. So I worked in the link between development and conflict and state institutions. For this report, I'd like to thank, first of all, the colleagues who worked on drafting this report together. Rami Khouri from Harvard University, Intisar Fakir from Middle East Institute, Daniel Kurd from the University of Richmond, and also the facilitators, Nader Hashimi from University of Denver and Andrea Stanton also from University of Denver. The report basically looks at the situation across the region in the Middle East and North Africa, and it looked at the pandemic, democracy and governance nexus from a regional perspective. It looked at the issues of the economic decline and economic issues that the region has been suffering from. It looked also at the situation of healthcare as affected by COVID and beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. It looked also at the issue of food insecurity, which is rampant in the region, and the vaccination rate. There's also another section that looks at what we call the alien political ethos in the region, which are issues of chronic governance issues, challenges, and the problem of the unachieved democratizations. And we all know what happened since 2011 until now. There's also a third section that looks at the impacts and performances in certain countries of the region. We have 4 case studies, one on Algeria, and it looks at the challenges and during the pandemic, and it looks also at what we saw 2 years ago is the Hirak, what was called the Hirak, that brought down the former president Bouteflika. There's another case study on Tunisia and the challenges of this fragile political transition. There's another one on Morocco, the way the country managed the issue of human development and the challenges faced during the COVID-19, and one other case study on Palestine, which was quite interesting, how Palestine had to deal with, the Palestinian Authority had to deal with the issue of COVID-19 and their colonial and the colonization. Then the 4th section looks more at the international and regional perspectives. And we basically, the main results do not differ a lot from what Tim mentioned earlier. I mean, we see a very worrisome continued challenges in terms of governance and rise of authoritarianism in the region, as we can see it from other parts of the world, but with a specific feature in the region, as that many countries of the region have been suffering from political instability and conflict, as we've seen since 2011. So while we considered the disparities and specificities of these different Arab countries, overall, the continuing crisis of state institution, erosion of trust in these institutions have intensified the already existing dynamic in this region. The report looks at the presence of weak and effective institutional structures in the Arab region, which can be traced to history of weak governance structures brought about by inadequacies of the governance model that has been prevailing since 2011 and probably intensified after 2011. We refer in this report to the social movement that were initiated in 2011 with the promise that these transition will move these countries to more of a rule of law based polities throughout the region. However, many countries suffered from breakdown of the old order, but did not manage to transition to democracies. And we see the chaos that countries like Libya, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen have been suffering from. And these issues that were already structural, chronic, were compounded in terms of complexity and challenges by what happened when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. There are different factors that, of course, explain this situation. You have internal domestic factors, but you have also regional, international, geopolitical factors that contributed to worsen the situation. So what we also argue in this report is that COVID-19 did not create the situation. It actually merely unveiled what type of sad reality exists in several of these countries and was intensified by more negative trends. The report argues that the pandemic, as I said, exacerbated existing structural flaws and institutional deficiencies in terms of government. The socioeconomic consequences of COVID-19 are and will most likely continue to compound existing challenges and threats to a number of states in the Arab region. The pandemic has laid bare structural weaknesses, fragility of institution, both national and regional. The socioeconomic effects have continued to unleash further contraction in terms of economic performance. Health threats have exacerbated the situation. And beside all these, there's areas where the health infrastructure is weak and lacks of sanitation and water, especially in places where you have conflict like Yemen and other places. Population living in areas affected by these conflicts have been suffering more than others. Of course, you add to them migrants, refugees, and here it's worth noting that the Middle East region hosts a larger number of refugees around the world. And what we have also noticed is that in several countries of the region, political groups have used the public sector even further to serve their own interest, while at the same time underfunding and sidelining the basic human and hard infrastructure required to provide effective health services, education, and also other vital services like water and sanitation. And we saw many attempts at popular uprisings again in Iraq before and after the elections. We saw this in Lebanon, we saw it also in Algeria, and most probably this will happen again in the near future. Tim, you said earlier, you mentioned the issue of trust, and the key speaker also mentioned the issue of trust, which is an extremely important factor here. People's trust in governments across the world, and especially as we saw and as we see in this report, across the Middle East region and North Africa broadly reflects this tendency. The trust between the people and their governments is at an all-time low. Population across the region, according to many statistics, we use several of them, including the Arab Barometer, have shown that there's continuing loss of trust between governments and the people in this region. And this is not surprising information, given that the region's rise in poverty, vulnerability rates to conflicts, and the low achievement in terms of human development have eroded that relationship between people and the government. And there has been calls since 2011 for a renewal of the social contract, as you rightly mentioned, Tim, and also has been stressed many times by the Secretary General of the United Nations in the recent report, Common Agenda. So basically, what the report unfortunately does not show any positive or very few positive trends in the region. And unfortunately, the main conclusion is that we are not much better off now than before in this region. There doesn't appear to be a big difference in how citizens and the state interact. Actually, it has gotten worse, and probably the fact that some states have used COVID-19 as justification for more authoritarianism, and also the use of technology that has allowed further sliding into authoritarian reflexes. And unfortunately, also the only positive transition that the Middle East and North African people were looking forward to was in Tunisia. Unfortunately, we have seen recently what had happened, and there's major regression at that level too. So the outlook doesn't look promising in the region since 2011, and even more so after the 2020 until now with the COVID-19. Of course, we do not want to end this discussion with a very pessimistic note. We're just trying to paint a realistic view of what's happening in the region. There is no determinism in history. We will definitely see ups and downs in the region. Is there going to be a recovery or a further decline in terms of socioeconomic achievement, especially that now we are in the what we call the decade of implementation of Agenda 2030 and SDGs that should be suffering from major setbacks, and we're not sure that most of them will be achieved by 2030. Yet, this is a region with a high number of young population, and what happened since 2011 has shown that we cannot foreclose any type of scenarios. And because of the dire situation that a lot of these countries are suffering from, we can expect further political instability and upheavals in the region, unfortunately. I will stop at this stage, and my colleagues who contributed to this report are more than welcome to join in during the Q&A to add to this summary. Thank you.
Thank you so much for both your management of the subgroup and for your work on the report. And indeed, I had an independent evaluator, a colleague of mine, read the reports, and when he came back on was, are you sure there's nothing, no silver lining at all in the Middle East context at all? And you brought it out right there at the moment, which has to do with the very youthful population, very educated and engaged population, impressive young people in the Arab region. And that was exactly the point I made to my colleague who I think you're right that the role of the experts is to point out when, to put a sobering conclusion out there, I think is very important and an important role for expert analysis. So thank you once again, Eunice, for that, and we will come back to that in Q&A. Let me turn last but not least to the most affected region in the world with regard to COVID-19, and that's the Latin America region. I'll turn it over to the director of the Latin America Center here at the ICRS and at the Corbell Schools, my friend and colleague, Oliver Kaplan. Oliver is a professor here who specializes in issues of citizen security and in areas of international peace and security. He's consulted with the International Committee of the Red Cross, USAID, and is working on a number of projects. Comes to us with a PhD from Stanford University and a background at the University of California, San Diego. Thank you, Oliver, for managing the Latin America subgroup, and with cases like Brazil and other cases that we've seen in the news just today, again, on El Salvador. I think this is going to be a very interesting report. So let me turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Tim, and thank you to our ICRS staff who have been fantastic throughout this process. Thanks to all of you for being here. For the Latin America report, we had a really stellar team of scholars that joined. We had Mike Alvarez from the University of Chicago, Gustavo Flores Macias from Cornell University, Rafael Llores and Enrique Estides Delgado from right here at University of Denver, Melissa Martinez from University of Mary Washington, Diana Senor Angulo from University of Costa Rica, and Amy Erica Smith from Iowa State University. And we came together to produce a report that I think kind of does what Abigail mentioned about Africa, is that it tells the story of how COVID played out in various different ways in the Latin America region. And in ours, we put together a number of case studies to illustrate these trends. And I think kind of impressively, as a working group, some of us never have met each other in person and had to do the whole Zoom, interaction, collaboration, but I think managed to pull off a really insightful analysis. And so our cases outline these different processes. And I think it's a little bit hard to think about right now here in Denver in the US, masks are starting to come off, but I think these effects of COVID, general COVID on democracy are going to be with us for a long time. So I think it's a nice moment to highlight these issues. So I want to start off with some of the basic preconditions that Latin America has witnessed, and Amy Erica Smith was really instrumental in helping pull this part of the story together for us. Latin America had a number of unfavorable preconditions, such as legacies of autocracy, high levels of inequality, party fractionalization, things that make it relatively difficult to manage a large-scale pandemic like COVID. And then, as Tim mentioned, it also had some of the worst case rates and deaths from around the world. With 8% of the world's population, it had something like 17% of the world's cases. It's had 30% of global deaths. In addition, child poverty has risen in the region from 44% to 51%, and 8 million individuals and counting have entered extreme poverty. So these effects on poverty, education, child welfare are likely to be lingering and affecting democracy. So in fact, International IDEA, in its analysis of what they call, quote, concerning developments for democracy and human rights, note that of the 24 countries they analyzed, 16 or 2/3 have these concerning developments. So all that together doesn't sound so promising, but we also found in our report what we might refer to as a type of reversal of fortune. I think anytime you can use the phrase reversal of fortune in the positive sense, that's a good thing. And so now Latin America is actually the most vaccinated region of the world. And that's in part, we think, due to the historical vaccine receptivity among the population. They're not to say that there's no skepticism of vaccines, but people have been largely receptive. So despite this difficult period. So I'm going to briefly run through our cases, touching on the issues of human rights, federalism, economic crisis and crisis management, militarization, corruption, and social mobilization. And I wanted to start with the case of Peru that Michael Alvarez wrote for us, looking at the case of what's called Vacuna Gate or Vaccine Gate. So playing off the Watergate analogy, anytime there's a big corruption scandal, you just end it with gate, and it's clear it's pretty bad. And in this case, there was corruption in Peru, but also corruption in many other parts of the region in terms of purchases of supplies, vaccination campaigns. There was high levels of mismanagement, but Peru maybe had the worst of this, or the most public version of it. Peru had also some of the worst effects of COVID. So about 10% of the population slid back into poverty. And then in February 2021, months before any of the members of the public were getting vaccinations, 500 government officials and insiders, including at that time the president, Martin Vizcarra, and his family, secretly obtained doses of vaccines. And then this made it into the public and really supercharged supercharged sentiment against the ruling elite, and it opened up opportunities for political outsiders, really generated, as we talked about, a lot of mistrust in government. And this opened up an opportunity for Pedro Castillo, a left-wing grassroots organizer and school teacher, to win the presidency on a campaign of no more poor in a rich country. I'd like to then move to our case of Brazil, which looked at the issue of federalism by Rafael Llores and Enrique Dias Delgado. And this case was kind of a tricky case because democratic erosion was already underway under Jair Bolsonaro's regime. And they document this, but they also document that the pandemic kind of led to what they call a democratic wake-up call for other levels and branches of government. And just two nice examples they point out. The state of Sao Paulo, as well as the state of Rio de Janeiro, were instrumental in actually mobilizing vaccination campaigns and research in the region and production. And so a state level organization in Sao Paulo, the Butantan Research Center, helped produce the Sinovac vaccine. Similarly, we saw some other initiatives in Brazil to provide pandemic emergency economic aid or economic welfare aid. And this was a program called Auxílio Emergencial, I can't say Portuguese so well, emergency aid. Thank you for that, emergency aid, which reached 68 million people. And this was not actually mobilized by the executive branch. Instead, it was by civil society as well as members of Congress. So we see other actors in that country mobilizing for positive responses. Then Melissa Martinez from the University of Mary Washington, who really does a deep and close look at human rights. It's maybe one of the most harmful trends in the region. She looks at the cases of Mexico and El Salvador, and those countries had somewhat different responses overall, where in Mexico, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador did not really take many early measures. He's seen campaigning with big crowds, without a mask, these super spreader events. By contrast, Nayib Bukele of El Salvador was much more strict. But in both countries, we saw different types of human rights abuses and repression. So there was the use of the military to maintain lockdowns in El Salvador. In different states in Mexico, we saw different patterns. So in the case of Baja California, the governor instituted a sort of a type of media repression, if you will, to kind of block out negative news about handling of the pandemic. And then in Jalisco, again, military officials were used to enforce lockdowns, generating some degree of physical integrity rights violations. And so those cases and that issue of human rights was sort of a more difficult issue. Then in Costa Rica, Diana, Senor Angulo, and I conducted an analysis of, in some ways, which is somewhat of an optimistic case, but Costa Rica was really constrained budgetarily in terms of how they were able to respond to the pandemic, but they did a fairly good job overall maintaining social welfare programs. But they saw a big decline in tourism, one of their main sectors. And so they needed some additional assistance. The president, Alvaro Quesada, went to the IMF to seek loan support. There was a lot of public opposition to this. And as a result of that opposition and protest, there was a movement that arose known as the Movimiento Rescate de la Nación, or the National Rescue Movement. And they came out resisting the initial terms of the loan, saying Costa Rica doesn't sell out, it defends itself, or Costa Rica no se vende, Costa Rica se defiende. And this led to, again, sort of a questioning of the trust in government, but it also led to a national dialogue that the president opened among these sectors and led to a more inclusive agreement with the IMF. And even still, one of the labor commentators observed that, we have a very explosive situation and the government has lost political legitimacy. And in fact, we're seeing Costa Rica in the middle of elections right now, which may see a turnover in terms of the party in power. And then finally, we have Gustavo Flores Macias talking about militarization. And just to note that he does a very interesting, diverse analysis of how the military played a role during the pandemic. First, he notes that militaries actually play very important roles to deliver health services, enforcing certain COVID restrictions, managing borders, maybe managing social unrest. And so there were some contributions of the militaries to managing the pandemic, but they also, in some cases, overplayed their hand, just as Melissa noted, that they engaged in some acts of repression. They were called out against protesters in cases such as Colombia in May 2021, when there were protests against a proposed budget reform or a tax reform, excuse me. And he really notes two important trends from the pandemic, that the militaries in Latin America may have some enhanced, longer lasting roles than they might have otherwise. And that it can also, as a result, undermine civilian control of government. So as the military takes on and maintains additional roles. And so to sum up, one of the things we see in Latin America going on now is what we refer to as an incumbent disadvantage. And so incumbents, people in power, are having trouble managing the pandemic. They're losing office. That's leading to some turnover in who's running the country. And in some sense, that's usually a good thing, we think, for democracy. So as there's turnover, it shows sort of a vibrant democracy, people showing dissatisfaction and voting for change. But even with that, there are still tough conditions. It's not clear how these new leaders are going to perform, whether they'll be able to deal with these after effects of the pandemic. And in some sense, this is sort of similar to the US case with President Biden and coming into office and having to deal with very difficult economic circumstances. If I have one moment, I'll just want to sum up our lessons and implications. We have a very nice sort of final paragraph of the report, and I'll just read a brief few sentences of it. We find that the trends in Latin America are not uniformly negative, as levels of repression and backsliding could also have been worse, suggesting democratic systems and norms in Latin America may be stronger than first appearances. And with the lessons and counterbalances that we identified, from federalist policymaking to inclusive social movements to new political actors, there's also a path the region can navigate toward more responsive governments and more inclusive societies. And I think that, with some of the more difficult examples, there are also some positive examples from Latin America, from other regions that I think we need to point to, we need to celebrate and learn from. So with that, thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Well, thank you, Oliver. And indeed, one of the terms that comes up in the Latin America report, which I think we can all appreciate as a term, is this notion of populist denialists with regard to COVID. And I think in Tanzania, that was also sort of the case where initially political leaders that engaged in this populism and denialism have in various ways kind of paid the price. And we'll have all eyes, of course, on Brazil as it goes into a future electoral process in that regard. I think we have a few minutes for questions. Anyone here in our in-person audience who'd like to raise a question or a comment on any of what you've heard here this morning? This afternoon? Thank you. Yes, please, Professor Tamara District.
For your reports, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I'll repeat your question.
So thank you for your report. Very interesting. I look forward to reading it in detail. My question is twofold. On the one hand, Tim, you mentioned the impact of stress on societies, often resulting in increased inflammation, polarization, identity groups. And I'm wondering if in any of the reports, and Abigail, you might have alluded to this, was there any evidence that stigmatization was specifically focusing on scapegoating of certain groups as an explanation for COVID-19? So beyond just the normal kind of stigmatization and discrimination, was it specifically scapegoating as a result of, or scapegoating the cause of the virus onto these groups? So that would be one question. And then the second question is a little bit on the flip side, which is, did you see any evidence of COVID-19 being an opportunity for people to bridge across groups?
Thank you so much for the excellent question. It's a two-part question for those who may be online or otherwise couldn't hear the question. It was around the extent to which during the pandemic period, minorities or marginalized groups have been stigmatized or further discriminated against, even more so than normal, with regard to either the origin or spread of the virus. And then I think a fantastic a follow-up question, which is very much the flip side: to what extent has the pandemic led to cooperation across identity groups in the creation of sort of, social capital that crosscuts different identity groups? So fantastic question. I'll turn it to Abigail for a reply.
Yeah, we don't capture stigmatization in the report, but we did observe in a few instances, particularly with Chinese people in Africa, because prominently on the continent, but also because the pandemic, the coronavirus initially was called the China virus. So that was a little bit of stigmatization we observed, but we did not have sufficient evidence to report on that. Another kind of stigmatization that we noticed, particularly in my travels over the winter break, was people did not really want to come out to say they're COVID, but they would rather take the different concoctions that were circulating and be done with it and not necessarily say COVID. And so when I got COVID and I tried to say I had COVID, they said, no, you're going to be okay, just take that. Like, they didn't want me to say that I had COVID. So that those kinds of kinds of instances that suggest that there's some kind of stigmatization that is going on within communities, but I was not able to detect exactly what kind of stigmatization is related to an ordinary person like myself. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. And Oliver, would you like to respond to anything along those lines? Okay, very good. Yeah, thank you. I think in terms of the question, we would have expected perhaps the pandemic to lead to a broader sense of collective destiny, that we're all in it together, and that in fact it should have sort of focused the collective mind on the need for cooperation. And unfortunately, we have not seen sort of very clear evidence of that. What we have seen is, in some cases, even with advanced Western democracies, for example, in the Global Report, there's a case study on Sweden, and that the importance of states to reach out to communities, in this case, more newly arrived migrant communities in Sweden, to be able to generate the trust and legitimacy to have the public health response. So it's really focused on, a lot of attention on this need for social inclusion and social integration, as the Latin America report indicated. Yes, please, Professor Peter Van Arsdijk. I'll accept the mic here.
Good, thanks very much, Ali and Tim and Abby, for this excellent presentation, plus your colleagues online. My comment might follow up on Tamara's question. Have you identified, even though you were looking at institutions, often in institutional structures, did you identify some actual champions, individual, everyday people, not politicians, maybe health experts or others, who stood out in this cause, champions?
Well, it's a very, very good question. I would be happy to open it up, and also to Eunice online too. We can manage that, and perhaps Eunice, if you'd like to reply, you could let Dustin know, and he'll let me know. But I'll turn that over to Oliver. Anyone stand out here in either the state Brazil or Peru or Mexican context that you can think of?
Yeah, this is a great question, Peter. And I think one of the trends we see across some of the regions and countries is government responding, but not being, all present, all effective, fast enough. And so I think in a lot of cases, these issues do, go down to the state level, the town level, the community level. And through a few projects over the past couple of years, I haven't been able to go to Colombia since right before the pandemic, but I've been in touch and conducted some research projects with a number of communities and individuals, and being in touch with people in the region. And I think in a lot of those situations, the local leadership, the community level leadership, community leaders, village leaders, had to take on a lot on their own to manage who comes in and out of their communities, manage public information about why it's important to wear a mask, hand washing, all those basic things. And I think at the citizen level, they're kind of unsung heroes. I would say a lot of people were doing that kind of activity in extremely rural, impoverished areas, not great access to supplies. And so, I think that kind of mobilization is really, really critical. I think, they had a lot of trouble maintaining local development programs, development initiatives, because it was hard to interact with neighbors, but they try to, keep those communities intact and keep them safe. So I think that would be a sort of very positive example with great difficulty.
Thank you, Oliver. Did you want to respond to that, Abigail, or aware of our time? Should we go to another question?
I think so.
Okay, very good. Let's go to one more question, and I think we'll just take a few more. Yes, Professor Singube Muyeba.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the discussion. My question relates to some of these measures that political actors took in that were, authoritarian in dealing with the pandemic. Do you see in any of the regions, do you see these as sort of precedents for how future pandemics will be addressed? Or, are they going to be part of the culture and end up affecting democracy?
Well, thank you very much. I'll respond to that one. I think one of the most important things that we've seen is that pandemics, and it goes back historically as well, sort of deeply reorganized social relationships. And this has been true in the sort of long history. Go back to our Camus on these sorts of things, on the plague and others. And I think that's what we'll be seeing in this case with regard to COVID and the COVID pandemic and its effects, that in fact they will rearrange social relationships. And well, I'll come back to that point in just a moment too. I wonder if any of my colleagues here or would also want to address that question. Yeah, please, Oliver.
Sure. That's a very interesting question, because the way a number of African governments responded to the pandemic was extremely brutal compared to other pandemics like Ebola, or malaria. They didn't do that, but it could be because of the highly infectious nature of the pandemic. And I really do not have sufficient evidence to be able to predict whether this would be the trend, but I certainly hope not, just because the number of deaths that came from the force of enforcing those measures was terrible, and a lot of lives were lost because of that. And so I'm hoping that the police will not be too brutal in the next pandemics. Hopefully not.
Thank you, and I think we have Eunice here on the line too, and wanted to jump in. Thank you so much, Eunice.
Yes, just two things. One that relates to the first question, talking about cooperation, but I just wanted to address it from an international perspective and regional. And it's obvious that we have not seen any major cooperation between countries or solidarity. We have seen actually quite the opposite, unfortunately. And this is an issue of the decline of multilateralism and the rise of nationalism, narrow nationalism, unfortunately. And this is something we saw also in the region. In the MENA region, it's something that is already the case for decades now, because it's the least integrated region where regional mechanisms are not working. So this is not new. Now, regarding this type of measures, whether in the future this is a harbinger of yet things to come, I'm afraid most probably yes, because what COVID-19 pandemic brought with it, it just accelerated a socioeconomic crisis of the whole development model and paradigm that is failing. And it is probably not enough to question the pandemic. If we want to go to the root cause of this, we have to go beyond it and look at this socioeconomic paradigm around the world, whether it's still working or not. And unfortunately, because of this, and because of the lack of the power of most governments, and the role of the state has receded so much around the world, that I don't think they could find solutions to the problem of development now. And the knee-jerk reaction would be to use more of a security approach to the problems until something else comes up. So I'm not very optimistic in the short and medium term.
Well, thank you, Yunus. I think that echoes sort of what would be my final conclusion. Is I want to thank all my colleagues for their fantastic work across these 4 working groups. Is that it's a wake-up call to the international community and to all of us more broadly about the effects of COVID and the pandemic on democracy, widening social polarization, distrust, autocratization and power grabs by autocratic leaders, increased corruption. These are all reflected very thoroughly in the reports. And so it is a wake-up call. At the same time, we have heard a lot already today, and is reflected in the reports, about resilience, about resistance to power grabs and to autocratization. But that resistance is always sort of what is the right balance between freedom and individual liberty on the one hand, and the collective good. And this is the sort of continuing conflict that we see playing out. But democratic resilience has been seen in places. And so we wouldn't want to completely say that, we convened 24 experts and couldn't find a single silver lining. That's just not the case. And what we've seen are things like innovation and adaptation, which is part of resilience. For example, the increased use of special voting arrangements in elections, and really increased processes like the national dialogue that you mentioned with regard to Costa Rica. So it is a wake-up call, but one that points us to avenues for resilience. And I think the final thing to keep in mind, and this is maybe my own personal reflection as someone who's worked on democratization and democratic processes over the years, is that often we've seen prior waves of democratization and increasing civil liberties and new institutions and innovations happen in the wake of crises. And I believe the pandemic may be one of those crises that creates opportunities for greater inclusion. And I'll go back to the Secretary General's comments, which Yunus also raised, about the importance for all of us to really rethink what is the basis of the social contract, because that is that sort of trade-off of personal autonomy and personal freedom for a collective or public good. In the reports, particularly in the global report, there is a look at COVAX as an example of global governance. And so the final point I would make is one that reinforced what Yunus just mentioned a moment ago, is that the project of global governance, of dealing collectively with what is a common issue that doesn't respect borders and that certainly doesn't respect passport controls and other kinds of things with the virus, is the need to reinvigorate global governance and to really rethink about our shared or collective destiny. And that's why I find our Common Future report to be so important, our Common Agenda report, which really builds on that common future. Let me wrap up with a couple of very important things. One is to thank Kelsey Burkhardt, who was the overall manager of the expert working group. Kelsey's here. Thank you, Kelsey, for all of the fantastic and exceptional competent work. Widely shared sentiment, as we can tell. I'd also just like to thank Callie Mitchell, who jumped in to help work on the Africa report, and she's here as well today. And last but not least, to my colleagues here in ICRS, Dustin Oliver, the program manager, and Anna Metropolis, our program specialist, for all of their good work, also helping facilitate the work of this report. Those reports there'll be a link coming your way. Thank you for participation in this event today. And with that will be a link to the 4 reports. They're substantive, they're evidence-based, they're widely cited and referenced. And so I hope that you find them to be a useful resource in wrapping our minds around what is a very difficult kind of relationship. And as a final comment, I'd say this is probably the most challenging aspect, is to say, well, we have these broader trends of autocratization about which we're worried, and it is a global crisis of governance around the world. I think, to what extent has COVID exacerbated, amplified, intensified these issues? It's quite evident that it has. But nonetheless, were there other underlying factors that were driving these trends to begin with? So I think, just to conclude, and maybe something to say before we all launch into our weekend, is that I think all of us collectively have a lot of soul searching to do about the trends in the world and what we can do as individuals, what we can do as institutions, to kind of reinforce some of those important points about our own collective destiny, or our own shared destiny, and the importance of looking out after each other. And I think maybe the pandemic has reinforced that basic point, that we're all in it together, and the effects on democracy have been severe and widespread, and it's time to take account of that and to collectively consider how to renew the social contract. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending today, and also online. And once again, all my colleagues, thank you for the good work on the ICRS Expert Working Group on COVID and Democracy.